An 80-year-old woman is facing a roughly $3 million fine from the IRS on a foreign account she inherited from her father, totaling about $4 million. Monica Toth was unaware of a federal law requiring her to report tax filings on her foreign account, which was held in a Swiss bank. Her father had fled Nazi Germany in the 1940s, moving to South America and running successful businesses. He kept his funds in a Swiss account for safekeeping, and when he died, he encouraged his daughter to do the same. She eventually realized she had not completed her tax forms fully and updated them so to comply with the federal law after not disclosing details on the foreign account for about 10 years. But the IRS did not care that the omission was unintended. It penalized her about $3 million, more than half of the funds in her account. Her attorney, Sam Gedge, asked the Supreme Court to review her case, arguing that the fine was excessive under the Eighth Amendment. But the High Court did not agree to take up the dispute. Mr. Gedge, a lawyer from the Institute for Justice, is joining us now to discuss what's going on with the case. Thanks so much for answering some of my questions in your client's dispute. One thing that came to mind for me was a case that was argued in November. It was involving a Romanian immigrant, Mr. Bittner. I think you mentioned that you're aware of the case, but he hadn't disclosed some of his foreign accounts that he had over, I think it was like almost 2 decades. He was fined, I think it was roughly $2 million by the IRS. The Supreme Court did take his case, and I believe that the question in that one is whether he should be penalized per tax filing or per account. I guess my question is, if what the Supreme Court does in that case, if they ruled for Mr. Bittner, would that impact your client at all?
So I don't think it would directly. The question in Bittner is kind of a idiosyncratic statutory question that's important for people like Mr. Bittner, but wouldn't necessarily apply to folks like my client, Monica Toth. At the same time, I think there's some kind of important big picture lessons we can take from Bittner, though, because that case is a great example of the federal government taking a really maximalist view of their power to impose these kinds of crippling civil penalties on ordinary people. That's something we see in Monica's case and in a bunch of other cases as well. So it really does drive home the importance of real, meaningful checks on the government's power to take millions of dollars of people's property.
And I'm sure there's some sort of factual or legal standard here. But when I was looking, I thought, okay, so he didn't report for almost 2 decades, I believe, when I looked at the different court filings in his case, and he was fined about $2 million. But with your client, I believe you said the total with like the late fees and everything was more than 2, right? Like almost 3, I think you said roughly. And she was omitted her filings for about 10 years. I don't know. It just seems like, an average person looking at that would say, how is that fair? That seems like it's subjective. There's no does that make sense what I'm getting at? Like there's some subjectivity with these penalties.
So I think it's a fair point. And if you had an IRS lawyer on this program, I think they would say, well, Mr. Bittner had been negligent in failing to file his reports, and Monica Toth, we think she was reckless. Now, what's the line between recklessness and negligence? I don't know. It's a tricky line, but it can have really massive consequences for people because it can be the difference sometimes between a $10,000 fine and a $2 million fine.
Right. And another question I had for you is, how does Ms. Toth's case impact other Americans? I mean, how far reaching could this be? I've covered the Supreme Court for about 5 years, and this is the first time I've seen 2 cases before the justices that related to foreign accounts and filing come across the docket.
Yeah, so I think Monica's case is important in the context of these FBAR, these foreign accounts, specifically because it spotlights, like Mr. Bittner's case, this phenomenon of the federal government for the past 10 years or so, really getting very aggressive when it comes to kind of taking as much as they can get with these reporting violations. But I think it's also an important case for people who don't necessarily have the means to have their own foreign bank accounts, because the ultimate question that we were trying to tee up in Monica's case wasn't really about foreign bank accounts specifically, but was more about, can the government get a free hand to take all of your property or an enormous amount of your property simply by doing it through a civil process as opposed to a criminal process? And that has consequences not just for people with foreign bank accounts, but for people who are facing, potentially crippling ordinance violations if they're, in their municipality, or people facing state penalties or federal penalties. It's a really nationwide problem.
Now, I don't know if you made this point in your court filing or if I know Justice Gorsuch dissented from the court not taking your case. And it could have been that I read this in his dissent, but there was a point made that by leaving this type of precedent with your client, that there might be localities that use, like what you were mentioning, the civil penalties to for revenue purposes. Is that something you can see happening?
I mean, that's absolutely a reality across the nation. One of the things that really sets apart monetary penalties, whether they're fines or whatever you want to call them, is that unlike virtually every other kind of punishment that the government can impose on you, imposing penalties, imposing fines actually makes the government money. And so there's this really structural incentive for governments, whether, again, it's federal or state or local, to take as much as they can get. And across the nation, you see typically municipalities, but even states and sometimes the feds being pretty open about the fact that one of the considerations that goes into whether they're going to impose fines or how much the fines or penalties are going to be is that they need to bolster their budget. And fundamentally, that's just not what criminal justice should be about.
Lastly, I wanted to ask you, so there's been reporting that the billions of dollars that Congress awarded the IRS might go to, beefing up the agency, maybe hiring more agents, whatnot. I'm curious, what that could mean in cases like your clients, or if we're going to see more cases like this. I already mentioned, the previous one that was argued in November. Are more people going to be subject to fighting the IRS in court?
I mean, I think that's a legitimate concern. I mean, if you have more IRS agents, there's, I think, a concern that there's going to be more IRS enforcement actions. I mean, the one other thing I would say, though, is that, in cases like Monica's, seems to be something of a bipartisan problem that hopefully could see a bipartisan solution. I mean, she was subject to an enforcement action spanning 10 years and 3 presidential administrations. The statute that gave rise to that really skyrocketing penalty was passed in 2006. And so, I think there's a concern that kind of regardless of the number of IRS agents on the ground or even the particular president or administration in office, there is this really almost hydraulic incentive for the government to try to enforce these kinds of laws to the nth degree to get as much money as possible.
Before I let you go, is there anything that we didn't discuss or a point that you think should be highlighted? I'm thinking, is there any other clients of yours that are in similar situations, or is this kind of the end of the road for your client in her case, given the Supreme Court won't take it up? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, so Monica Toth's options are certainly more limited now that the Supreme Court has denied review in her case. But to your broader point, we certainly represent lots of different people from all walks of life who are facing really devastating financial sanctions, from people who are facing tens of thousands of dollars in municipal fines for parking their car the wrong way in their driveway, to folks who are facing $30,000 in foreclosure because they didn't mow their grass in time. So the one thing that I think is important to me about these kinds of cases is that these kinds of civil penalties and fines have real consequences for real ordinary people. And it's something that the courts need to take seriously.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time weighing in on this and giving us the implications of your client's case.
Thank you.
To read more about this case, you can go to WashingtonTimes.com.